Hey everybody, today we're going over adding rational numbers. This video is just covering fractions though. Some ideas to remember is that when we're adding rational numbers, our same rules are applying for the ones that we use for adding integers. Those two rules are spelled out here. So when adding rational numbers with the same sign, let's say -2 plus -2, we can add the absolute values of those two and then keep the same sign that we started with. So the absolute value of -2 plus -2 is 4. We keep the sign we started with, so our answer would be -4. Second rule, when adding rational numbers with different signs, though, we need to subtract the absolute value of the lesser from the greater. Then use the sign of the greater absolute value for your answer. So if we chose -6 plus 2, -6 has a greater absolute value, so we'll take 6 minus 2. That gives us 4. Now we keep the sign of the greater absolute value. It's negative, so our final answer is -4. If we were to do one similarly, -2 plus 4, 4 has a greater absolute value. 4 minus 2 is 2. We keep the sign of the 4 since it has the greatest absolute value. We get 2. Again, these are just reviews from adding integers. Let's talk about adding fractions. So the first thing we have to remember with adding fractions is that our same rules will apply. So for the positives and negatives, we can do just what we just talked about. But for the first example there, we're already seeing something that's special about adding fractions. We first need to make sure that we have a common denominator. No matter what our fractions look like, we always need common denominators. In this case, my first step was to say instead of 1 1/3 plus -1/6, I'm going to make both my mixed numbers into improper fractions. Then I'll find a common denominator. I look for the least common multiple of 3 and 6. That happens to be 6. So I only need to change 4/3 to be 8/6. I multiply the top and the bottom by 2. Now I can go ahead and add. Now one more thing with adding fractions is that when we have this negative number right here, my first step is always going to be, or a step that I'm going to do is always going to be to put the negative with the numerator. The reason I'm doing this is that when we're adding fractions, we add or subtract our numerator and our denominator stays the same with that common denominator. Putting it with the numerator makes it a lot easier, so I suggest you do it too. Same goes for this one. So I'm first going to say instead of -8/3, this is -8/3. Then I'll add 5/6. What do I need to do first? Well, now I need to make both these denominators common. Just like we'd seen over here, we know that 6 is the common denominator for 3 and 6. So I can multiply this fraction top and bottom by 2. I would have -16/6, and I'm adding 5/6. Same rules apply. I have a negative plus a positive. Those are different signs, so we'll subtract. We would get 11. -16 is the bigger absolute value, so we get -11. It's going to be over 6. I can take one last step here and make this a mixed number. That's -1 and 5/6 remaining. Let's talk through one more example here. Now, just to make sure that everyone's listening to this, what I want you to do is go ahead and draw a little star around B and write all of B out too. So we've got -4.5 plus 2 1/4. I first made both my numbers into improper fractions instead of mixed numbers. Now I'm going to do 2 steps from here to here. I'll first make my denominators common. 2, I can multiply that by 2 to get to a denominator of 4, which would be in common. Therefore, I need to multiply numerator and denominator by 2 to get 18/4. Again, I'm going to put my negative in the numerator. Now it's -18 plus 9. -18 plus 9, well, I subtract those two and get 9. -18 has the bigger absolute value, so we keep that sign. It's now negative. My last step here is to go from -9/4 to a mixed number. This isn't always a necessary step, but if it tells you to rewrite the improper fraction as a mixed number, you have to. Our final answer there would be -2 1/4. Let's try one more together. The last thing I could ask you to do is evaluate. What evaluate means is to find the value of this expression if you're given the x value and the y value. My first step is to go ahead and substitute those in. If I have 2x plus y, I'm taking 2 and multiplying it by x and then adding my y. In this case, I have 2 times a quarter plus negative 2/3. If I multiply that first term, when we're multiplying fractions, remember, we multiply numerators and denominators. So 2 times 1 is 2. 2 technically has a denominator of 1, so 1 times 4 is 4. That fraction is 2/4. Now I have 2/4 plus negative 2/3. I need to go ahead and get those into common denominators. Our common denominator here, well, I went ahead and simplified 1/2, or 2/4 to 1/2. So 2 and 3 have a common denominator of 6. Now you can see we have 3/6 plus negative 4/6. If I subtract those numerators, 4 minus 3 is 1. I keep the sign of the negative 4, so my final answer is negative 1/6. So just remember, always keep the sign with the numerator. You need a common denominator, and in order to find a common denominator, we need to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number. And when we add fractions, we add the numerators, but the denominator stays common. The next video will cover decimals, which are rational numbers. We just covered fractions today.